Good day. Video games can be just as iconic as films, if not more so, because with a film you just sit there and watch it, but with a game you actually interact with it. You sort of grow with it as it goes along. And game franchises are even more interesting than film franchises in many respects. Take the Resident Evil franchise. This franchise started in the late 1990s and still ongoes today. Now, the interesting thing about the Resident Evil franchise is that it has changed throughout the years, and we, the fans of it, have grown along with it. Now, here's the interesting thing about me. I don't necessarily like the Resident Evil games, and that's mainly because I completely suck at them. Surprisingly enough, I actually got into Resident Evil via the novelizations, and I also have a review of the very first novelization up on the channel. And if you guys want to go watch it, I definitely recommend it because it is a very good read. And if you suck at the early Resident Evils like I do, it's a viable alternative. Now, the first Resident Evil I actually truly enjoyed as a game rather than just a story was Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 is an example of an iconic game. Now, iconic games haven't been altogether that common as of late. In fact, I can't really name altogether that many in the past 10 years, really. The only game that I would really classify as iconic is really the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Oh, I'm sure there's many that I'm missing, but let's face it, are games today really iconic? They may be good, but will they actually be memorable 10 years from now? And what exactly makes an iconic game? Why do we remember some games and just sort of go like, oh, that game over there was pretty good? A good example of games not being altogether that iconic is Bulletstorm. Bulletstorm is an example of a game that was extraordinarily hyped when it came out, but how many of you have actually thought of Bulletstorm in the intervening years? I know I haven't. In fact, it wasn't until I heard a song by Miracle of Sound that I even remembered the game existed, and I remember having quite a bit of fun with that particular game. Now, Resident Evil 4 was released in 2004 for the Nintendo GameCube and later for the PlayStation 2 and also for the PC. The PC version was, of course, complete crap, and it required modders to actually make it playable. Now, the version of Resident Evil 4 we're going to be reviewing is the original version, the GameCube version. Why are we going to be reviewing this one, you may ask? Well, that's because this is actually the version that I played. Now, I played Resident Evil 4 around 2008-2009. That was back when you could get a GameCube for like 20 bucks. And, well, when I heard this, I took my limited funds and bought me a GameCube and a couple of GameCube games. Unfortunately, not Eternal Darkness, but oh well, Resident Evil 4 was definitely worth it. Now, what exactly is Resident Evil 4? Well, on the surface, RE4 is a typical behind-the-shoulder third-person shooter. But here's the interesting thing. This is the game that really popularized the concept of the over-the-shoulder view. Prior to this game, third-person shooters really just had the camera behind the character, like right in the middle. Whereas this is a bit different. I actually prefer this form of third-person shooter to the classic style simply because I feel like you have more control over your character, and you can aim slightly better this way. Now, this game also introduced a precise aiming mechanic. Essentially, all your various guns will have some sort of sight, be it laser or otherwise, and you can get a lot of precise headshots. Now, in the game, you actually have a variety of options for the various guns that you use against your various enemies. Now, one of the big problems with modern games is the lack of choice. Usually, you just walk down linear corridors and have a very linear series of progression. Whereas in Resident Evil 4, while it is definitely a linear game, you actually have more choice as to how you want to take out your enemies. You could do some stabby-stabby with a knife, you could just use any number of pistols. Really, how you play the game is up to you. Much more so than a lot of the later linear installments of this particular game. I'm looking at you, RE5 and RE6. Now, in the game, you actually have to exercise some sort of tactical sense. You can't just run forward and shoot everything. Oh no, this game is still survival horror like its classic ones. Now, while I'm definitely certain that this is not quite as survival horror as, say, RE1, it still is in that genre. It is not just a third-person action game. That, of course, is expressed in the turret-like controls and the fact that while you can carry numerous guns, you still have very limited ammo, and you can't just spray and pray. And you really have to do your build just about as intelligently as a build in Dark Souls. And, of course, who can forget that inventory system? You'll see all over Tangerwebs people constantly talking about this inventory system, and you know what? Everything they say is pretty much true. In order to carry all the crap you need to stay alive, you definitely have to get very good at inventory management, because it will fill up quite a bit. And you have to definitely play a little game of Tetris to make sure everything can fit. Now, one of the other iconic elements of this particular game is the merchant.
Got something that might interest you.
In context, this guy doesn't even make any sense. But you know what? If he wasn't there, the game would lose a great deal of character. And that's really what this game has. It has character. A lot of the older iconic games have that character in and of themselves. These days, a lot of games really just rely upon brand recognition, or they're a sequel to a long-running series. But Resident Evil 4 forges its own identity. It doesn't just cash in on the fact that it's a Resident Evil game. And that's really why it stands out amongst many of the other Resident Evil games, really. It has its identity, and its identity is in characters like this pirate guy, and it's also in the overall design of the game. This game is not realistic in any sense of the word. This game makes no sense when it comes to level design. Every place you fight through does not make a bit of logical sense. For example, why does this castle have a lava area? Yes, I know it's supposed to be molten lead or whatever, but still, why is this here? Even when I was playing it and having a blast with it back in the day, I had to stop and ask myself, why is this here? Why is it so hard to get around this castle? How long must it take to go check the goddamn mail? Hell, you could practically almost die before you even get out your front door. Graphically, the game looks amazing on the GameCube. I was blown away with how good this game looked. And I would say the graphics held up then, and while they definitely don't hold up now, when you play this game, you're not really going to go, oh my god, that looks so horrible. The character models still look damn good, even by today's standards. Sound design for the game is absolutely amazing. And it amazed me back in the day. All the various ambient sounds are actually pretty bloody scary. And when you hear an enemy sneaking up behind you and either laughing maniacally or mumbling creepily, if you have a good sound system or some really good speakers, that'll make your spine tingle just a little bit. Voice acting for the game is, well, Resident Evil standard, and sort of ties into the very concept of Resident Evil's storylines, but we'll get to that in a moment. Music for the game is decent enough, I suppose. None of the tracks really stood out, sans the typewriter theme. Essentially, when you go to a typewriter, a soothing melody will play, and it will help calm your nerves a little bit. Now, the story for Resident Evil 4 is interesting. Resident Evil never has had really good game plot lines. They've always been really cheesy or, well, really stupid. While I love the novels, the games don't really express what happens in said novels, and that makes sense, I suppose. But, well, let's just face it, Resident Evil doesn't really have a very good story when you think about it. Umbrella is titanically stupid, using all these various snarly monsters to kill everything when a bomb would actually do. But anyway, in Resident Evil 4, they've tried to go for a more campy aesthetic while still keeping the horror. And for the most part, it works. Really, if the game had no voice acting at all, it would definitely be a better game for it. Because the game has tremendous atmosphere that is absolutely exquisite. You can get really scared when you play this game, and then you'll have to talk to a mutated Napoleon.
Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before the audience gets pissed off?
You're nothing but an extra in my script, so don't get too carried away. Your biggest scene is over.
That kind of ruins the immersion. Really, there are no real characters here, and the plot is as basic as you can get. In fact, the plot is pretty hilarious. Essentially, is Leon Kennedy, a returning character from Resident Evil 2. He was actually the hero in that game alongside Claire Redfield. Now, Leon Kennedy was an interesting character enough in the novelizations. In fact, he actually got his own novel with a variety of other Resident Evil characters where he had to fight a mutated T-Rex, so to speak. Leon has basically no character, but he has to be a bad enough dude to rescue the president's daughter and also stop an evil cult. Now, the evil cult, in theory, is cool. You pick up a bunch of documents throughout the game that really play up this cult being really evil and really mysterious and generates a lot of mystery. The new enemy are called the Las Plagas. Essentially, they're brain worms that allow people to mutate and things of that nature. And as you read them, you uncover the mystery and all that, and then you got mutated Napoleon, and then you got Bond villain de jour, then you got Leon Kennedy basically having all the personality of a brick, and then you get through that, and then you can start reading more documents and getting back into the story. Really, I don't understand why the story was so sloppily handled. On the one hand, it's really good, but on the other hand, it's really quite bad. It's just uneven for the most part. Really, if you skip all the cutscenes in the game and just focus on the gameplay and the story as told by all the various notes you can find, you'll actually have a slightly better experience, I'd have to say. One final thing to note are the enemies. These days, the only real difficult game is Dark Souls, and so we often like to say, oh yeah, that game's as hard as Dark Souls. But back in the day, all games were pretty bloody difficult, and RE4 was no exception. The basic foot soldier in RE4 are called the Ganados, and these guys, while easy to kill or run away from, are still a credible threat. Why? Because there's always a huge number of them, and they attack you with a very implacable nature. What does that mean? Well, you can shoot them in the head, and they might fall over and die, or they might mutate and have a giant gaping mouth pop out of their neck stump, or they can just keep on walking towards you slowly, ready to cut your throat with a bloody knife. They are pretty bloody scary and pretty bloody threatening in their own right. I am certain that just about every player of RE4 has been killed by these guys at some point. Now, in classic games, there always used to be that one enemy, that one bastard that killed you over and over again. In this game, it's Dr. Salvador, the man with the chainsaw. Oh, sure, you might think, let's just shoot him in the head. You can. That just pisses him off. Really, Dr. Salvador has got to be one of the most iconic enemies in the Resident Evil franchise. He is just that badass. This game also has a wide variety of really awesome boss fights that require a great deal of strategic thinking, and you have to figure out ways to use your environment to your advantage. So as you can no doubt imagine, I highly recommend Resident Evil 4. And thankfully there are a wide variety of options for playing this particular game. You can get the Ultimate HD Edition on Steam for fairly cheap, and I'm pretty sure with a few other mods it might actually be extraordinarily playable. And in its base form, it's decent enough. But that's not your only option. You can of course download it on Xbox Live or PlayStation Network, and I can only imagine that both of those ports are perfectly serviceable. You can get the original copy, or you could just bloody well get it on almost anything up to and including a TI-84 calculator. Well, you probably can't because this isn't Doom. But anyway, getting RE4 isn't a difficult proposition. And really, just about all the ports are more or less the same as one another. And really, you can't go wrong with Resident Evil 4 on just about any platform, although I would recommend not getting it for the TI-84 calculator. Get it for the TI-86! But in any event, it's definitely a game worth playing. And with that, this is General Lotz wishing you good Resident Evil Revelations! Oh yes, we're going to get to that game at some point. And good Resident Evil Revelations 2! Hopefully that thing will actually be halfway decent. Or whatever makes you happy.
Storm coming, bullets getting hot in those guns drumming, somebody's getting shot. There's a storm coming, about to lose control of your rear plumbing. Fire in your home.